Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and welcome to the Marian Miner Cook Athenaeum. We're so happy to have you back for our first indoors programming for the spring semester. I'm super excited about it, and for an absolutely wonderful presentation tonight. But before I begin on that, just 3 quick reminders. 1, please keep your mask on properly for the entirety of the presentation. If you have anything that you would like to ask about that with the Ath Fellows, you're always free to find me. And the second thing is, we will have an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation. So you are more than welcome to take out a piece of paper and a pen right now and write down notes as you go if you have something to ask at the end. But finally, please silence and fully put away your cell phones. Yes, so paper okay, cell phones in the bag. There's no audio or video recording in the Athenaeum. From May 31st to June 1st, 1921, a white mob attacked black residents, homes, and businesses in the predominantly black and vibrant Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was one of the worst race riots, or more accurately known as a racialized massacre in history. The white mob were deputized and given weapons even by city officials, and they killed an estimated 300 people in just a matter of hours and displaced thousands. In the following years, people in Tulsa would actively suppress and censor information, attempting to make murder disappear by destroying records, newspapers, and headlines. Professor Scott Ellsworth, an award-winning writer and historian, was one of the initial scholars to investigate and reveal the violence in the 1970s, 50 years after the event had occurred. He actually did it while a student in college in Portland, Oregon, and he began his inquiry by going back to his hometown in Tulsa to do the pivotal research that led us to this knowledge today. He revisits that work in the book, Groundbreaking, An American City and Its Search for Justice, which was longlisted for the 2021 National Book Award. He is currently a professor in the Afroamerican and African Studies Department at the University of Michigan. We are so honored to have Professor Ellsworth with us today as an exemplar of rigorous investigation into historical injustice in our communities, and as well as for making critical connections from the past into our present lives with the legacy of racialized violence in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ellsworth.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here, and of course, I'm sorry that my son Will is not here tonight. This was initially his idea to bring me here, but he is still testing positive for COVID. So look, I just want to, let's just dig right in. So the Tulsa Race Massacre was the single worst incident of racial violence in all of American history, okay? So in less than 12 hours, more than 1,000 African-American homes and businesses were looted by a white mob numbered into thousands and then set on fire. Hundreds and hundreds of people received medical attention after the massacre, but to this day, we do not know how many people died. I think reasonable estimates go from somewhere in the 70s to as high as 300, but we don't know if that number is 79 or 299. 10,000 people were made homeless. 35 square blocks were razed. If you look at photographs of the massacre, easy to find these days if you look online, and the Greenwood community looks like Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So how do we explain this? Where does it come from? What happens, and what do we do with this knowledge? So the place to begin, I think, is in Tulsa itself. They called Tulsa the Magic City, as in now you don't see it and now you do. In the year 1900, there were less than 1,000 people living in what was called Tulsa Town, a dusty Muskogee Creek and cowboy town. Imagine a Western movie set, unpaved roads, one unpaved street, things like that. By 1921, on the eve of the massacre, there were over 100,000 people living in Tulsa. The city had 20-story skyscrapers, a vibrant downtown, electric streetcars, waterworks, electric works, movie palaces, the whole works. And the reason for that was oil. In 1905, 2 years before statehood, what was the richest small oil field in the world was discovered across the Arkansas River from Tulsa. Okay, and this is at a moment when in the developed world, the world's energy economy is going from coal to oil. This is also the rise of the automobiles happening, and Tulsa hits that moment, and people pour into Tulsa, and money pours in and out of Tulsa as well. And some of that money went to the city's African American community. African Americans in Tulsa made up about 10% of the population. They lived in a pie-shaped wedge of a neighborhood emanating out from downtown known as Greenwood. And the Greenwood community was an amazing one. Even though there's only 10,000 people living there at the time, there were 2 newspapers in Greenwood. There was an all-black hospital. There were 2 African-American schools. There was an all-black library branch. There was also, there were 2 theaters in Greenwood. One, the Dreamland, sat 750 people. The other, the Dixie, sat 1,000. This is no food desert. There's more than 36 African-American restaurants in Greenwood, as well as 24 groceries and meat markets and, smaller food markets as well, too. There are black-owned hardware stores, dry cleaners, all nature of different kinds of businesses. But Greenwood, there was more to Greenwood than that. It was also an especially vibrant community, intellectually as well as socially. W.E.B. Du Bois had come and spoken in Greenwood prior to the massacre. There were missionary circles, book clubs, lots of things. This is also the time when this incredible new music that's conquering the world is invented, which is jazz. And there were lots and lots of jazz musicians from Tulsa who then go on and perform in the bands in Kansas City, in Chicago as well, too. So you have this community, and there are perhaps a dozen families, African-American families, that are really doing well by national standards. They live in modern 1- and 2-story wooden homes. They have automobiles, chandeliers, pianos. Their daughters take dancing lessons, things like that. You have maybe another couple hundred families in Greenwood who are smaller entrepreneurs, maybe own a tailor shop or a dressmaking operation. But these folks, these businessmen and businesswomen, they have an entirely African-American clientele. So you've got a community where portions of it, where the American dream is truly working for African Americans, okay? But while this prosperity and this vibrancy is happening, there are also very dark winds blowing across the United States at that time. People don't think about this often, but the years around World War I were some of the worst in the history of American race relations. This is a time of a rising white militancy that you can see from coast to coast. This is the era of the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. The second Ku Klux Klan gets founded in 1915, but the Klan is no longer just a Southern organization. It is national in scope. The Klan ends up running the state governments in New Jersey, in Indiana, in Oregon, in Oklahoma eventually. There are Klansmen in Maine and Vermont. There's Klansmen in Los Angeles. And, hooded Klansmen, thousands of hooded Klansmen march down Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House to the Capitol. So the Klan is very much a part of things as well, too. And they're not just anti-black, they're anti-immigrant, they're anti-Catholic as well. This is also an era of lynchings. While the number of lynchings are starting to decline nationwide, the barbarity of lynchings has increased. A particularly horrific lynching happened in Waco, Texas in 1916. A young African-American man accused of raping and killing a white woman was lynched in front of a crowd of more than 10,000 people in Waco, of whites, including women and children. Children got out of school to watch this. Washington was tortured, castrated, had his eyes gouged out, and set on fire. The reality is that the United States is one of the few countries in the first decades of the 20th century where human beings are getting burned at the stake. And this is also an era of what everybody referred to as a race riot in that day. Black commentators, white commentators, everyone knew what a race riot was. Typically, there's some sort of a racial incident that blossoms into whites attacking African Americans in downtown areas, and then white mobs invading black communities. There was a famous one in Chicago in 1919. The beaches along Lake Michigan were segregated. A group of black boys had built a raft, launched it from the black beach. The wind blew it in front of a white beach. Whites started to stone the boys on the raft. That broke into fighting on the beach that spread to downtown, and then gangs of whites invaded black neighborhoods, but also desegregating neighborhoods where they targeted African American homes, set them on fire, destroyed them, and looted them. So this is the era that's going on, and you see the rise of segregation in cities in the North where African Americans had been welcome at theaters and restaurants in the past. They're now getting barred. All right. So how do African Americans deal with this? I mean, and that's a very tough question. Some turn more and more to religion, others putting their faith in education. But you also have a new group on the scene, which are World War I veterans. So the American Army was still segregated during World War I, but black troops and all black units with white officers fought in France, and they fought with particular gallantry and heroism. In fact, many of the first croix de guerre bestowed by the French government on American soldiers were to black troops. They also found that they were treated with dignity and respect, in a type of dignity and respect in France that they were not in the United States. Many of them wondered, why am I fighting to make the world safe for democracy when there is none, that I'm getting none at home? And so many of these black vets came back very much with the notion that when these mobs come, we're going to meet fire with fire. As one black vet in Chicago said, I ain't looking for trouble, but if it comes my way, I ain't dodging it either. Okay? So this is all in the stew. This is in Tulsa as well. But there's something else in Tulsa too, which is crime. So Tulsa is a boom town. And in boom towns, there's lots of crime because somebody can go to bed, poor as a pauper, a wildcatter. The next day he hits a gusher and he's a millionaire. I mean, there was just money like crazy. So there was a lot of prostitution in Tulsa. There was a lot of theft. There was a lot of auto theft. In fact, there was so much auto theft that the New York insurance companies would not insure cars in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But in August of 1920, there was a crime like no other that started to change everything in Tulsa. Now, this incident is all about white people. So there were, one night in August of 1920, 3 white teenagers, 2 men and 1 woman, hired a cab in downtown Tulsa to drive them across the river to a dance, okay? So they get in the cab, they cross the river, they're out in the country going towards this little oil town called Red Fork. And one of the young men, 18-year-old named Roy Belton, pulls out a .38 caliber revolver, sticks it in the side of the cab driver, tells the cab driver to pull over. Cab driver pulls over, sticks his hands in the air, says, take anything you want, take my money, take my cab, whatever, just don't shoot me. But instead, Roy Belton shoots him twice in the stomach and then kicks the cab driver out onto the country road where he's to die. Meanwhile, the 3 teens speed off with a taxi cab. Well, what happens is, out of the blue, a farmer just happens to be driving by, sees the man, the cab driver in the road, picks him up, drives him to a hospital in Tulsa where he lingers for 3 days, all right? Now, this crime got gigantic front page coverage in the city's white newspapers, the Tulsa Tribune and the Tulsa World. The most dastardly crime in the Southwest, and whatnot. People were just absolutely outraged by this shooting. Meanwhile, Roy Belton gets picked up by the police. He's brought to the hospital bed where the cab driver is. The cab driver fingers him as a shooter, okay? Roy Belton is then put in a jail cell on the top floor of the Tulsa courthouse right downtown. Meanwhile, there's lots of people talking about lynching. There's also people saying that Roy Belton will escape the electric chair because he's going to plead not guilty because of insanity. So the cab driver then dies, And the next day, a lynch mob, now of whites, starts to show up outside of the courthouse, okay? The Tulsa police are nowhere to be seen. In fact, the taxi cab where the shooting had happened had been taken from the police impoundment lot and brought to the courthouse where these hundreds and hundreds of whites are out gathering to lynch Roy Belton. A group of the members of the mob with bandanas over their face, guns drawn, go into the courthouse. They demand of the sheriff that he turn over Roy Belton. He does. Belton's put into the taxi cab and then driven out. There was a caravan of cars 3 miles long that take him out to where the shooting occurred. The Tulsa police now magically show up, but rather than try to stop what's going on, instead they direct traffic so people can park and be able to watch this. So Roy Belton is then lynched, okay? What's remarkable, though, is in the next following days, his lynching is praised by the mayor of Tulsa, the chief of police of Tulsa, the white newspapers of Tulsa, saying this is a good thing that happened because it shows the criminal element that the law-abiding citizens of Tulsa are not going to put up with any more of this crime. The only dissenting voice comes from the Tulsa Star, which was the leading black newspaper in town, which not only condemns the lynching, but it also says that the lynching of Roy Belton explodes the theory that a prisoner is safe on the top floor jail of the Tulsa County Courthouse. Okay. We now move forward 9 months. We're in Memorial Day, May 30th, 1921. An African-American teenager named Dick Rowland, age 19, who works as a shoe shiner, is walking on Main Street from the white-owned and white-patronized shoe shine parlor where he works. He's walking a block and a half down Main to go to the Drexel building. There were no toilet facilities for the African-American shoe shiners in the shine shop, so the owner arranged for his shoe shiners to go down the street to ride the elevator on the top of the Drexel building to a colored restroom that's there. So this is something that Dick Rowland probably did once a day. This is nothing unusual. All right, now in those days, elevators are not automatic. They aren't push button. So you have an elevator operator, in this case, a 17-year-old white teenager named Sarah Page. She turns this wheel that raises and lowers the elevator. And it's very hard to get the floors of the elevator and the actual floors to line up, all right? And we know from a former elevator operator at the Drexel building, this elevator was particularly persnickety. It was hard to get it to work. So, but something happens this day. Dick Rowland walks onto the elevator, Sarah Page screams, and he runs out of the building, okay? This is what we think happened. We think that as he stepped onto the elevator, he tripped, that he shot out his hands to break his fall, that he caught Sarah Page in the shoulder. She probably screams out of shock more than anything else. He's terrified, runs out of the building. On the first floor of the Drexel building, there's a clothing store. A white clerk runs out of it, hears a scream, runs out in the hallway, sees Dick Rowland running, and he comes to the conclusion that Dick Rowland has tried to attack Sarah Page, the elevator operator. Okay. So the Tulsa police are summoned. A couple of officers show up, but they don't particularly seem to be particularly concerned about this. They probably take statements, we don't know. They don't put out an all-points bulletin. They don't go roaring off to go find Dick Rowland. The next morning, they do arrest Dick Rowland. He's arrested at his mother's house where he lives in Greenwood. He's taken to the courthouse, put up in one of those jail cells on the top floor of the courthouse where Roy Belton had been. But the wheels of justice, even Jim Crow justice, seem to be slowly turning. Sarah Page will refuse to press charges. Dick Rowland will ultimately be exonerated. But what happened that day is a reporter for the Tulsa Tribune, the afternoon white daily newspaper, caught wind that something happened at the Drexel building. So on the front page of that first edition of the Tribune, there was a write-up, a nabbed Negro for attacking girl in elevator, this highly exaggerated write-up that said that Dick Rowland wouldn't give his name to the police. He said his name was Diamond Dick, that he wore a diamond stick pin. that he had been observed stalking Sarah Page, looking to make sure nobody was there, and that he had torn her clothes and scratched her face and hands in what was clearly a rape attempt. Okay, so but there was something else in that issue, May 31st, Tuesday, May 31st issue of the Tulsa Tribune, which was an infamous and now lost editorial titled "To Lynch Negro Tonight." So Roy Belton, a white, had been lynched 9 months earlier. Now Dick Rowland's going to get lynched. The Tribune hits the streets at 3:30. By 4 o'clock, there's not just lynch talk on the streets of Tulsa. Now there's lynch activity as a mob starts to gather outside the courthouse. 100, 200, 300 people. Women and children as well as men. All right. The Tulsa police force, once again, is conveniently gone. But there's something new. And what's new is there's a brand new sheriff, a crusty old former cowboy, rancher, school teacher named Willard McCullough. And Willard McCullough has determined there will be no lynching on his watch. He has blockaded the stairs in the courthouse, disabled the elevators, and even though he's only got 4 deputies, he's put them on the roof with high-powered rifles. Okay. So people go to demand that the sheriff turn over Dick Rowland. He refuses. All right. Meanwhile, word now hits Greenwood. Now you have to remember there's, of course, no internet in those days, no television, no radio. Telephones are even few and far between. So a lot of this is all word of mouth. Word hits Greenwood that a young African-American male is in grave danger downtown. A black vet jumps up on stage at the Dreamland Theater and says, "Shut this place down. We ain't letting this happen here. There ain't going to be a lynching here." Others start to gather right in the Greenwood commercial district known as Deep Greenwood, trying to figure out what to do. We're not sure. Finally, at about 7:30 that night, 25 African-American World War I vets, many of whom have already gone home and put on their old Army uniforms, all of whom are armed with rifles, pistols, and shotguns, get into cars, drive in a caravan down to the courthouse, get out of the cars, march single file right up to the courthouse, go up to the sheriff and say, "We're here to help defend the prisoner if you need us." The sheriff says, "Get the hell out of here." They get back in their cars and go back to Greenwood. But their appearance has absolutely electrified the white mob, which is now, 500 or so people. Members of the mob now go home to get their own guns or to get their neighbors. Several dozen mob members march over to the National Guard Armory to try to gain access to the high-powered Springfield rifles there. They are prevented from doing so by a couple of local National Guard soldiers. But the city is starting to spin out of control. Once again, Tulsa police are nowhere to be seen. And as the hours go by, the rumors fly, and the size of the lynch mob grows and grows. 600, 700, 800, 900, 1,000. When are we going to do this? What are we waiting for? What's going to happen? Finally, around 9:30, a false rumor hits Greenwood that the whites are storming the jail. So this time, 75 African-American vets get into cars, all armed, repeat that first caravan, go down to the courthouse, present themselves to the sheriff. He once again sends them away, and as they are leaving, an elderly white man goes up to a tall black vet who had fought in France and says, "Where are you going with that gun?" And says, "Well, I'm going to use it if I need to." He says, "Like hell you are, give it to me." A struggle ensues, a shot goes off, and the massacre begins. All right. So a lot of things happen kind of all at once. So there is a shootout that occurs right there in the courthouse. We don't know how many people died. I don't think it's a lot, surprisingly, but there are some. The father of my older brother's best friend, the father was a young doctor working downtown late at night in Tulsa, heard the firing. He went to come out, grabbed his bag, and went out there. He saw an African-American man who had been shot lying on the ground. He tried to reach the man, but the crowd wouldn't let him. The crowd, meanwhile, were stabbing him to death. Okay. There's not a lot, we don't have the light pollution that we do today. There's not a lot of street lamps. So we think that most of the black vets were able to fight a retreating battle back to Greenwood safely. Okay. Now, the white mob, meanwhile, now they don't care about Dick Rowland. They are now consumed with this racial bloodlust and out to get any African American they can. And we have evidence of innocent, unknowing black workers who just happen to get off of their job as a cook or a dishwasher or janitor. We know of a black woman that was gunned down in the street by a group of whites in a car on Boulder Avenue. We know another story of an eyewitness told us of an African American man being chased by a group of whites down an alley. He ran into the back door of a movie theater that was showing a movie, worked his way onto the stage, sort of blinded by the light. As that happened, another group of whites came pouring down the aisle and dropped him with a shotgun. He fell into the orchestra pit. So this is going on. Now, the Tulsa police magically show up, all right? But instead of trying to disarm the white mob to send them home, instead they do two things. The first thing they do is they start deputizing members of the mob, giving them special deputy ribbons and other credentials. Second thing the white police officers do is they start breaking in to sporting goods stores and pawn shops, smashing the windows and doors to get in to gain access to the guns that are sold there. And we know from a white eyewitness who was handed a gun and said, you know, get a gun and get a black person. So this is happening. Now, over the next 4 hours from 10 o'clock to about 2 a.m., again, a lot of confusion, lots of things happening. There are a few fires set along the far edges of the African American district, Greenwood, but they end up being put out, and in part because there's a lot of white businesses nearby, okay? We know that there were some murders along the edges. An elderly couple was praying at their bedside when whites came in and shot them in the backs of their heads, murdering them. We also know that carloads of whites armed with guns made drive-by shootings down residential streets in Greenwood, firing into living rooms, children's bedrooms, whatnot. And there was an early effort to invade the deep Greenwood commercial district, which was separated from white commercial neighborhoods by railroad tracks. But black property owners were able to hold them off. Again, not a lot of street lights. They were armed, hold them off. So what happens is that about 2 o'clock in the morning, we're now on June 1st, everything sort of calms down. Now, there are African Americans who have already decided to leave Greenwood. They are walking out the country roads, navigating by starlight. Others are unaware of things. Still others are starting to relax a little bit. You know, whatever this is, it's over. The sun's going to come up. Things will sort out in the morning. But what the residents of Greenwood don't know is whites are organizing. So white men are going to all-night speakeasies and cafes, telling people to come to this neighborhood or not. Others are spreading the words in the neighborhood. At a street corner, somebody will stand up on the hood of a car and say, we're going in at dawn. Make sure you got plenty of ammunition. Make sure this is where we're going to go, do and all that. So while African Americans in Greenwood are starting to relax, they don't realize that white mothers and grandmothers are putting another pot of coffee on the stove to keep everyone awake for the dawn invasion. So right before dawn on June 1st, there was a survivor I interviewed, the first interview I ever did, a man by the name of W.D. Williams. In 1921, he was Bill Williams. He was 16 years old, and he was Greenwood royalty. His family owned the Dreamland Theater, which this big, marvelous theater. They also owned an automobile garage where they fixed cars. They were the first black family in Tulsa to have a car. They also owned a 3-story building, the Williams Building, a brick building. On the first floor, there was a confectionery, a candy store, ice cream store. On the top floor, they rented it out to offices for black dentists, doctors, and lawyers. And then there were apartments on the second floor, including their family's apartment. And Bill Williams told me, and during that earlier effort to invade Greenwood before 2 a.m., he had helped reload his father's repeating shotgun and .30-30 rifle to stem that invasion. But he told me right before dawn, he looked out the window across the tracks, and he said it looked like the Milky Way. And there were all these points of light, and those were the cigarettes and cigars and pipes of thousands of whites who had gathered. Okay? Dawn comes, sun comes up. There is a siren that we still don't know what it was, like a factory whistle that goes off, which is clearly the signal for the invasion of Greenwood to begin. And at that point, whites start marching towards Greenwood. Not just all men either. There are women. There are even, boys as young as, 12 years old with single-shot 22s or shotgun, 410 shotguns who start going. And what happens is, and I'm having to condense a lot of this, but there's this systematic destruction of Greenwood. Any African Americans who fight back are overwhelmed because remember, whites outnumber blacks, 10 to 1 and 9 to 1 in Tulsa anyway. Any African Americans who are found still there are then, quote, arrested by members of the mob, of the police, the National Guard, and taken away to what become these hastily improvised internment camps, quote, for their own protection, some of which was true, but also it prevented them from defending their homes. So at the auditorium, at the baseball park, the fairgrounds, there was a survivor I knew quite well named George Monroe. He was only about 4 years old at the time of the massacre. His parents, Osborne and Olive Monroe, owned a roller skating rink in Greenwood. And right before the invasion begins, the mom and dad and the kids are all there, and they're mom and dad are trying to figure out what to do. And there was a great fear that any black man found in Greenwood is going to get killed. So the decision was made that the husband would take off, which he did, and the mother stood there with the children. When the whites came to their home, she said, "Look, we ain't done anything to anybody. Please don't burn our home." They told her to shut up, hauled her away. The kids kind of scattered. George and his older sister, Judy, ran back into the family home, and George and Judy hid under his parents' bed. He told me that he could see the feet of the white man as they walked into the room. One of them stepped on his pinky. He about cried out, but his sister Judy threw her hand over his mouth, so he didn't. He didn't cry out. The man didn't notice he had stepped on his finger. George told me he could hear them rifling through the drawers of his parents' dresser looking for money or jewelry, and that they then lit the curtains on fire before they left. George and his sister were able to escape. But this goes block after block, house after house, and what they do then is that the whites will then break into all these buildings, they'll loot them, and then they will set them on fire. Block by block by block. All right, now there are African Americans who are fleeing this. There are other African Americans who are fighting to the death to protect their community. There are fierce firefights that happen throughout Greenwood as this wall of destruction happens. But, once again, African Americans are outnumbered, but they're also outgunned as well. So the local white National Guard units have been placed along the border of Greenwood and a well-to-do white neighborhood. They have machine guns which they point towards Greenwood, and as the morning goes on, they start joining with the white rioters in attacking the community. There was a beautiful brand new brick church, Mount Zion Baptist Church, which was erected at a great amount of money, huge, beautiful rose window. The National Guardsmen shot that out. They shot out the belfry, and African Americans are just overwhelmed. But there's a new danger too, which is from the sky. Now, there's not a lot of airplanes in Tulsa in 1921. We think there were about 6 privately owned or by oil companies. But there's very convincing evidence that at least one of those airplanes, a co-pilot or a rider in the passenger plane, dropped lighted sticks of dynamite down on Greenwood. So Tulsa is, in fact, the first American city bombed from the air. So this wall of destruction happens, and by 9 o'clock in the morning, when state troops from Oklahoma City have arrived by train 100 miles away to enforce martial law, to put this all down, it's too late. Greenwood has been absolutely destroyed at this point. So 12 churches burned, one of the schools, both, all of these restaurants, everything has been laid to waste, okay? All right, so the massacre has happened. The massacre is also front page news. It's front page news in the New York Times. It's news in Chicago and Los Angeles and St. Louis. It makes the Times of London, makes the Times of India. And Tulsa's white city fathers realized they had a huge PR problem because they're trying to grow the city, to boost it, to be the oil capital of the world. And these stories of mayhem, destruction, martial law, train travel interrupted are a problem. So they tell the world that the white people of Tulsa are ashamed of what happened. What we refer to now as the Tulsa Race Massacre has been called a race riot, a race war, the Tulsa disaster, the Tulsa incident. It's been called a pogrom. And my own thinking is that I'm not sure if we have the right term yet. Back in the early 80s, when I was getting ready for my first book, Death in a Promised Land, to be published about it, I'm finishing the manuscript. I'm just trying to war with what to call this thing. And I considered using the term massacre at the time, and I went to W.D. Williams, Bill Williams, that young man, and now quite elderly, and I said, hey, W.D., what about call it massacre? He said, hell no. He said, we got as many of them as they got of us. So, I shied away from that. It is called a massacre now, but it's called a massacre because the word race riot, the meaning of that has changed. So back in the 1920s, everybody called it a race riot. The Chicago Defender, the NAACP, the Norfolk Journal and Guide. It's the Tulsa Race Riot, because everybody knew what a race riot was. But then race riot is a term that got applied to what we now refer to as the racial rebellions of the 1960s in Watts and Detroit and whatnot. And there was, in part, a feeling that the words race riot meant that both sides were equally culpable. There was also this mythology that it was deliberately called a race riot to keep African American property owners from getting their insurance claims paid, which is not true. So I don't know what to call it. But massacre is what it's being called now. We'll see if that's the term for the ages or not.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Emma, a freshman, and I'm wondering, who do you think played the most important part in this whole race riot? And also, what do you think more we as a society can do to help, make more people acknowledge this, the existence of it?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So I try to outline some of these larger national winds that are blowing. There's also winds that are there's also aspects in Oklahoma that are very important. Oklahoma didn't become a state until 1907. And before that, it had been Indian territory. It was the terminus of the Trail of Tears when the southern tribes were moved out. And many of them had slaves as well, African American slaves who came and lived in Oklahoma. But Oklahoma was also seen as a place of promise for African Americans. If you were a slave in Arkansas or Texas, you tried to get to Indian territory. That was the place to be because the chances you were going to have a better life there. There were efforts at the end of the 19th century to turn Oklahoma into an all-black state. They failed. But, when settlement was open to non-Indians, there were lots of African Americans from Mississippi and Arkansas and Louisiana and Texas who risked everything to come out to this promised land. And they're trying to get the boot of Jim Crow off of their throat. And so they come out, they create more all-black towns than any other state in the United States. A lot of those fail because there's just not enough money to sustain them, but they're trying to take control of their lives. And the other thing that happens is that, when white lynch mobs gather in Oklahoma, black people show up with guns, and they're ready to stop them and prevent them. So there was very much a sense that this is our place, we've risked it all, this is where we're going to be. So that's a part of it as well. I think that, one issue has been the term Black Wall Street, while it has some origins in the 1920s, nobody called it that in the 1920s. Nobody called that in the 30s, the 40s, or the 50s. It's a term that really comes into being in the 1990s. But part of the Black Wall Street issue is that Black Wall Street has been so exaggerated that it becomes that the real reason for the massacre is that whites were jealous of all this money in Tulsa, in Black Tulsa. The jealousy, some of it is there, it's true, but it's been exaggerated, and what it does is it totally washes away the story of these incredibly courageous 75 black vets. I don't think a single one knew Dick Rowland, but they risked their lives, and many of them gave their lives to make sure that he wasn't going to be murdered. But to me, the real key role is the media. You know, I mean, that front page story and editorial in the Tulsa Tribune, that's really the incident. It's not what happens, you know, in the elevator. And certainly how the media kept the story suppressed, and eventually how we were able to use the media to get the story out. So that holds very chilling lessons for our own day and age, where people live in their own media bubbles. And I'm just going to listen to the type of media that supports my politics, and I'm not going to necessarily hear what this other group does or even know what's going on.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
Hi, Scott. My
Hey.
name's Matthew. I'm a senior here at CMC. First, I want to just say thank you so much for coming and talking to us tonight. This was really interesting.
Great.
So I kind of have a two-part question. So first, it'd be really interesting just to hear you talk about how you kind of unearthed this entire project and that process for you, because it's very interesting to me that something so historically significant could basically just like disappear from the history books for so long. And then also on a more personal note, as someone who's from Tulsa, what was it like for you to learn about this past event of your hometown that kind of just can largely change your view of a city?
Sure. So as to the first question, I could talk for a long time, but I won't. The real key is a moment in August of 1975. I'm a 21-year-old rising senior at Reed College. I've come back home to Tulsa to research my senior thesis about the massacre. And all that summer, I just couldn't make any headway at all. I couldn't find records. There was no stuff. I couldn't figure out how this thing had happened. And I heard about W.D. Williams, this young Bill Williams, who, you know, of the Williams family and all that. And I asked if I could come and talk to him, and he agreed to it. And this is not about me, and that's one troubling part of this story. It could have been anyone else. It just happened to be me. But that was the story. Finally, the history all made sense, because he had read the Tulsa Tribune that afternoon. He had seen the "To Lynch Negro Tonight" editorial. He had read it. He'd seen the front page covers. And when those bound volumes of the Tribune were microfilmed in the 1930s, already the front page story had been cut out, and the editorial had been ripped out, never to be seen again. We got the front page story. He had been in the Dreamland Theater when the black vet jumped up on stage and said, "We ain't gonna let this happen here." He had been, and none of this is reported in any newspaper. He had been, you know, on Greenwood Avenue when he watched the 25 black vets go and the 75 black vets. He had helped defend his family's property, and he had escaped with his life. So that was the moment when it all made sense. And then 3 years later, when I'm a graduate student at Duke, I got money to come back, turn my thesis into a book. And he helped introduce me to other elderly African-American survivors who had been adults during the massacre, none of whom had ever done an oral history interview, most of whom had never told their family, but they agreed to talk to me. And I've always felt that, I mean, I was their witness, and I've always felt a responsibility to them in terms of helping to encourage me to get this story out and get the truth out. You know, as a young Tulsan, Tulsa, I grew up in an all-white neighborhood. I went to Robert E. Lee Elementary School. I was born 2 months before the Brown decision, but it's not until I'm in high school that I have my first African-American classmate. I went to an all-white church, all that. The 60s are happening, but they're happening on television, you know. You know, I'm in the 3rd grade when the great, you know, campaign in Birmingham, 5th grade Selma and all that. You know, so, I heard snatches of things from here and there, but I was just learning the whole way. I mean, I was so ignorant that when I went at Reed College, you know, that year I decided to do my thing on the Tulsa race riot, I hear about this historian named John O. Franklin. My gosh, there's a book, an entire book on the history of black people in the United States. Then I find out he's from Tulsa, and I'm just, you know, mind blown. So this has been, you know, a continuing process of just learning a lot.
Thank you.
You bet.
I just want to say thank you for your talk and also for the book. I've never been at an ATH talk that gave me a free book, and I really appreciate that as a student.
Let's hear it for Priya. And I'll sign them afterwards.
I will definitely take you up on that. So I'm a freshman at CMC, and I plan on studying government and history. My question for you, and you kind of touched on it with your previous answer, but I understand, or I assume that a lot of the conversations you had were probably very traumatic or deep or meaningful. And I was wondering, what was the conversation maybe with a descendant of someone who had been part of that lynching mob or who had been part of that white mob that attacked African Americans in Tulsa? Is there an interview or moment that really stands out to you, a conversation that you had? And then kind of branching off of that, how do you feel that that community or those descendants, do you feel like they've changed now that this massacre is more widely discussed?
Well, as the first part, I wish that I had had those discussions. The reality is that we've never been able to get any white person that was involved in the massacre to talk about it. And part of that has to do with the fact that there's no statute of limitations on murder. The second part has to do with shame or just, not wanting to cooperate and things like that at all. So those conversations, simply have not happened. And I would say it's only been since the 1990s that there have been any whites that have come out of the woodwork to even talk about things that they heard, from family members. Within the last 2 years, I heard from a classmate of mine that I went to a big downtown public high school. I didn't know her well. I didn't know her at all. But she told me a story when she was a little girl about an elderly friend of her grandmother's who would talk about, going hunting for black people during the massacre and how proud he was of that and thought it was a great joke when she's a little girl in the 60s. And her grandmother would get her to hush up. But, even stories like that are only now coming up with someone say, well, I'm thinking my granddad was involved with this or my great-granddad, but it's taken a long time. The second part of the question, that's complicated. Greenwood, there was always, despite the fact that in the newspaper and in public ways, up until the late 60s, the massacre wasn't discussed publicly in Greenwood. There were individuals like W.D. Williams who kept the story alive, and others as well, too. And, I think that, and they always had a lot of pride in the fact that we fought back and that we didn't move and we didn't run away and we rebuilt. John F. Franklin, whose father actually was a survivor of the massacre, said that there were stories after the massacre of black women seeing a white woman wearing their fur coat downtown or their pearls, and they would just simply snatch it off their back and take it back. He said it didn't matter whether the story was true or not, but the fact is it reflected the pride in the community. The Greenwood community to this day has no shortage of pride. People know who they are. They're very proud of what they've been able to accomplish, and they're very angry about all that's been denied to them.
Thank you.
You bet.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk.
Sure.
I was particularly astonished by the amount of vivid detail that you could go into, especially about the types of guns that the white people were carrying in order to hunt down the black people. How were you able to get that information from history? Was it through oral history or was it through archives?
Well, it can be different. I mean, part of it is, I've been at this off and on for 45 years. So, you see stuff in newspapers, you catch little bits here and there. And, I'm a writer as well, and I write for a general public. And so you always have your ear attuned to those little small details that will help you to that. But I think it has to do with just familiarity with what it is, rereading, going back, noticing stuff that you maybe didn't notice the first time and thinking, oh, that's significant, or just trying to work out in your mind, how certain things, may have happened, and coming up with, I'm as a historian, I'm always tethered to evidence, but at times you're gonna go as far as you can with that because you're trying to make a point as a writer.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, I think I've taken all the air out of the room here.
No, not at all. Actually, I was going to say, Professor Sinha, did you have a question you wanted to ask? Because we do have.
Hit me again.
Yes. Thank you. This was very disturbing, but yet very powerful talk. So it is good to, it's good to hear, and it's necessary for us to hear this. My question also had to do with the interviews with the whites, and the literature in history and in genocide studies has focused on perpetrators but also bystanders. The people, like you said, women and children were part of it, but we know that when riots happen, there are a lot of people sitting on the fence, but then there is a whole crowd psychology created that they participate.
Yeah.
Were you able to get, some window into the people who were on the fence but yet participated, their psychology or anything like that?
Not too much, because again, it was very difficult to find. I've never found any participant who would talk to me or any other researcher directly. In that summer of 1978, I found that there were two white members of the Tulsa police force who had been members in 1921 that were still alive. So I got their phone numbers out of the telephone book. I called them up. I called up the first one, and I said, "Hi, I'm Scott Ellsworth, blah, blah, blah. I'm writing a book about the Tulsa race riot," and he hung up on me. So I decided to change my tactic with the second one. I called him up, "I'm Scott Ellsworth, and I'm writing a book about the history of the Tulsa Police Department. I was wondering when I could speak with you. When can you come over?" And, I went over and I interviewed him, and I kept trying to get him to talk about what he did during the massacre, and he kept dodging it. I kept trying and trying and trying. So, we haven't, but there's little bits of information. So my high school, Central High School, was in existence in 1921, and I found an account about on that morning, it was a school day, and on that morning kids are in class, and they could hear some of the firing, they could see the smoke in Greenwoods, and there were, 3 high school boys who said, "I'm not sticking around," and bolted out of class. They ran towards the violence, what was going on. As they were coming that way, an older white man had a shotgun and a box of shells. He said, "Boys, I'm done for the day. You can have it now," and gave it to them and armed them, and he took off. So it's been hard to do that. There's another account of a white grocery store clerk who showed up at work that morning as the owner was locking the front door and saying, "It's, N-word day. I'm going to go and kill black people, and you don't have to work." So, you see that rolling, that happens. The one thing I do...
like a tidal wave, right?
Yeah, but the one thing I do want to mention, and didn't get a chance to, as horrific as much of this story is, this is also an incredible story of human perseverance and courage and guts. Not only did Black Tulsans rebuild Greenwood, but get a load of this. A week after the massacre, once they're freed from these camps, let me put this, 85% of black adults in Tulsa who were employed, and the employment was very high, worked in the white community as domestics, as household servants, dishwashers, janitors, all that. They worked for white families. They worked in the white community. They got a good paycheck, cash, at the end of the week. But they didn't spend it downtown. They spent it in Greenwood, which allowed this commercial district to boom. A week later, these people are going back to their jobs. Imagine the courage it took to do that, to go back in those neighborhoods where people had tried to kill you. And I'm sure they're doing it with their head held high. And the fact that they rebuilt this city, that's something we can all learn from. So as much as there's heartache, I think there's something about human achievement here too.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott, for your wonderful presentation and for all of the amazing answers in the question period. Thank you so much, everyone. We will also have a book signing at the end. Scott, we can do that up here if you'd like.
Wherever you'd like.
Yeah, so...
So I go back there. Where's the exit?
There's the exit right
I'll go there
so
and
we
then
can
I'll
go there
catch you on
and we
the
can
way.
set up there. But thank you so much, everyone. Please have a wonderful night.